Well, good evening. My name is Ali Colon. I'm the Knight Chair in Media Ethics here at Washington Lee University. I'm also the chair of the Fishback Committee that oversees the Fishback program for visiting writers. The Fishback program began in 1996, thanks to a generous gift from Sarah and William H. Fishback, Jr., W&L class of 1956, in memory of Margaret Hagan Hopt Fishback and William Hunter Fishback. The program brings an outstanding writer to the Washington Lee campus annually. The Fishback Visiting Writers meets with students in the classroom and delivers a public lecture, which will be starting soon. The lecture is also being sponsored by the Department of Journalism and Mass Communications, Department of History, and the Office of the Provost. This year's Fishback speaker is Jamelle Bouie. He is a columnist for the New York Times. He is also with CBS, where he works as a political analyst. Jamelle Bouie has been a chief political correspondent for Slate magazine, a staff writer at the Daily Beast, and held fellowships at the American Prospect and The Nation magazine. He attended the University of Virginia, where he graduated with a degree in political and social thought and government. David Uberti wrote in the Columbia Journalism Review that he considered Jamelle Bouie one of the defining commentators on politics and race in the Trump era. Based in Charlottesville, Jamelle Bouie focuses on politics, history, race, and where such issues might connect and disconnect. In one of his recent columns, he showed the connection between authoritarianism and the Jim Crow South. In another, he wrote about the 15th Amendment and the right to vote, and noted another resolution that might have offered at that time an opportunity to, quote, beyond the race discrimination and what that might have done. When I interviewed Jamelle Bouie, I asked him if he saw history as a way to explore and explain the present. He responded that that is a thin line to walk. Quote, present isn't the past, he responded. Bringing the past into the present might lead us to facile solutions. We don't know what the future will bring. Part of the idea is not even to make a point about the present, but you have to think about historical events to understand the present. In the moment of the thing, no one knew what would happen. So it's useful in the exercise to understand what they were thinking. I find it interesting thinking about the contingency. It can help us understand whether things are heading in a certain direction and the way things are now for the future. As we wrestle with the present, we can benefit from our Fishback writers' thoughts tonight. The original title for this talk was The Civil Rights Movement Today, A Second Redemption. But Jamelle Bouie decided to update and expand on that thinking and the challenges it represents. So tonight, he will focus on the following: unequal, unrepresented, and undemocratic. How to fix America's broken Constitution. Please welcome Jamelle Bouie.
Hello. Thank you for having me. Yeah, I live in Charlottesville, and I rarely make it out this way, but it's been a real pleasure to visit, to see the scenery a little bit, even though it's gotten kind of gloomy as the day's gone on. Okay, so the original title, it's worth explaining. Back when I wrote that title, it was maybe 2015, Black Lives Matter is happening. That's sort of where my head was. But I've been, since then, since I got to the Times last year, thinking much more about sort of the things that have gone wrong in the American political system and American government, the ways in which our expectations for what should happen are not being met, the ways in which our political institutions are creating gridlock, are creating challenges that we cannot, or rather the challenges we meet cannot be met because of features of our political system. And so tonight I just want to talk through some of my thinking about that. Over the last year, I've written a couple columns dealing with various forms of institutional change, institutional reform, and you can consider this sort of me kind of summing up the things I have been thinking about over the last year about our political system, about American politics, and about the ways in which it's failing us, and the kind of drastic ways it may need to change to produce a more sensible politics. Actually, the genesis of this thinking was looking back at the 2016 election, and this may sound like trivia, but noting how 2016 marks the end of a cycle. And the cycle is basically the American public going through various configurations of partisan control. A normal person doesn't find this interesting. I'm not a normal person, so I found it very interesting. If you look, we've had 9 national elections since 2000. 2002, 04, 06, 08, 10, 12, 14, and 16. 20, this year is the 10th. If you look at the sequence of elections and look at the results of those elections, you'll see basically a series of wide partisan swings. So in 2006, 2000, Bush wins. 2002, Republicans deepen their majority. 2004, he wins re-election. But then in 2006, we have a big wave election. Democrats win the House and the Senate. I remember this election very distinctly because it's the election where George Allen lost re-election, in part because he insulted my suite mate in my dorm. Sid Harth lived 2 floors. We lived on the same floor, and I distinctly remember seeing the news and being like, I know that guy. So 2006, big wave election. 2008, another wave. Democrats deepen their control in Congress and then also win the presidency. So we go from Republican president, Democratic House and Congress, to unified Democratic control in 2008. And then in 2010, we go from Democratic president, Democratic Senate, Republican House. We keep that for 2012, and then 2014, we have Democratic president, Republican Congress. And now we have Republican president, Republican Congress, and then in 18, we get Republican president, Democratic House, Republican Senate. If the pattern continues, then this year, maybe Trump wins re-election, but we have a Democratic Congress. And then in 2024, we start all over again with unified Democratic control. Of course, all of this is very contingent. It's not guaranteed in 2010, for example, that Republicans don't win the Senate or that Mitt Romney doesn't win in 2012. Swap out different candidates here and there and you get different outcomes. But I think it's pretty striking that if you just sit back and watch, you have voters, and I'm going to use this handheld mic to illustrate. You have voters going from one set of partisan control to the other, to the other, to the other, and then going back again. And I think if you look at it like that, what you see are voters looking for something. They're switching up partisan control for some purpose. What are they reaching for? What are they trying to do? And I think the obvious answer is that they're looking for some configuration of partisan control that would do something in government. The striking thing about the last 10 years of American government has been that it's not really working. It's rigid, it's slow, it's unresponsive. You might say it's low energy. It's tempting to say, well, that's just government. But in the 90s, even with all the partisan conflict between President Clinton and the Republican House, things still got done. At the beginning of the decade, in 2000, 2002, or last decade, or I guess now 2 decades ago, I keep forgetting that we're not in the previous decade. There was some movement, but 2010 to 2020 has been kind of a perfect example of what gridlock in government looks like. The only reason we even had something done in 2009 is because of the financial crisis and the wave that produced. Washington has essentially stopped trying to solve problems. Congress goes from temporary budget to temporary budget, defers important decisions, and we've kind of been running not on autopilot, but on sort of the least possible work you can do for a while. The Trump administration, I think, has been distinctive in how little major legislation has been passed. I know there are a lot of liberals who look at Trump and say, well, he's gotten everything he wanted. If you just look at what's happened over the past 3 years or so, they got a tax bill, and that's kind of it. Everything else has happened administratively or through the executive branch, or just confirming judges and executive branch positions. And even then, the administration isn't confirming very many executive branch positions. It's a lot of acting positions, which is just to say that nothing's really happening, which is also to say that voters aren't necessarily wrong. There is gridlock. There is something broken in the system. Where voters are wrong is this idea that we can fix it by finding new sets of people to go in. The problem isn't with the politicians. The politicians are just following the incentives provided by the system, and the incentives provided by the American political system right now are towards gridlock, are towards stasis, are towards doing everything you can to get a narrow partisan advantage, in the process essentially breaking the way American government's supposed to work. And since 2009 in particular, we have emerged with this almost new party system. We don't just have two parties, we have two highly polarized, ideologically distinct parties. And this, I think, is it's worth noting how novel this is. 50 years ago, you didn't just have moderate Republicans and liberal Republicans and moderate Democrats and conservative Democrats. You had liberal Republicans in the Northeast. In Massachusetts, you had liberal Democrats in South Dakota. You had conservative Democrats in New York. You had conservative Republicans in California. Each party contained really the entire geographic and political diversity of the country. The parties weren't particularly coherent. This was in fact a big complaint for political scientists in the 50s. They looked at European parties and they saw these well-organized, well-structured, ideologically coherent parties, and they said, we wish Americans had that, right? That here, if you vote for a Democrat in Minnesota, you're empowering, Strom Thurmond in Congress. And that doesn't make any sense. It'd be better if we could have parties that reflected coherent perspectives held by two sides of the country. Well, that's what we have, and it's kind of been a disaster. What our system's designed for are these non-distinct political parties, to the extent that it's designed for political parties, where coalitions are formed within Congress based off of things that aren't necessarily partisanship. Maybe they're formed around particular geographic interests. Maybe they're formed around particular issue concerns, but they aren't formed around this partisan divide. When the Constitution was ratified, the Founding Fathers, in fact, envisioned this sort of fluid kind of national government as a thing that would happen. Of course, within 10 years, we have political parties. Within 10 years, most of the framers are kind of somewhere between enemies and frenemies. George Washington, by his second term, has really estranged a lot of the people that were with him at the Constitutional Convention. And in 1800, we have political conflict between the two sides so fierce and vicious that it kind of almost tears the country apart. And yet, we're able to muddle through because there isn't the kind of ideological coherence between the parties. They're relatively diverse. They're barely parties as we understand them. And so the system can kind of work. Even though it's not designed for parties, it can kind of work. When the parties do become polarized, though, in the 1840s and the 1850s around slavery, it is, as we all know, a complete disaster. That polarization ends up producing conflict that resolves itself in violence with the Civil War. So we've already seen a period of American history where non-polarized parties become hyper-polarized, and then because the system cannot handle polarization, it just collapses entirely. And to the extent that we fix that, it's only because we took the issue, and when I say we here, I mean a select group of Americans, took the issue that was causing the polarization. First slavery, then race, and set it aside. At the beginning of the 20th century, the parties came to basically a bargain. We're going to leave the South alone. We're going to let the South do its thing. And once you take that off the table, once no longer the two sides are polarized around their view of the Southern issue, around the race question, then you do once again get these fluid parties. You get liberals in both parties, conservatives in both parties, fluid coalitions happening between the two sides. Our modern era of polarization begins with the civil rights movement. By taking the question of race and bringing it back into national politics and forcing action on it, forcing decisions on it, the civil rights movement essentially polarized the entire country around the question of what is the role of blacks in our society? What is the role of race in our society? Politicians began to sort themselves accordingly. So by the end of the 60s, racial conservatives, which is, I guess, the polite way to put it, have largely migrated to the Republican Party or are beginning the migration to the Republican Party. Racial liberals are beginning the migration to the Democratic Party. And then once this sorting happened, the rest kind of just followed, right? And so by the end of the 70s, we have a Democratic Party that is not just liberal on race and liberal on government, but largely liberal on gender, increasingly liberal on religious issues. It's kind of liberal all the way down. And the Republican Party is likewise kind of conservative all the way down. This is distinct, but it's still a little different than what we have today. What we have today is that polarization integrating itself across categories that aren't even really political. So now it's not just that if you're a Democrat, you have liberal views on race and gender and religion, generally. Not everyone, but generally. Now it's that if you are a Democrat, you probably live in an urban area, and you probably live in a certain kind of neighborhood, and you probably watch certain kind of shows and shop at certain kind of places. At Cook's Political Report, a guy, Dave Wasserman, has his Whole Foods index where he's sort of like, some people, Democrats live near Whole Foods, Republicans live near Cracker Barrels. Both wonderful establishments. And I think that's a little reductive, but it does capture something, right? That you can take something as trivial as the kind of restaurant you're from, and from that extrapolate a bunch of qualities about the voters because of how polarized we've become on this horizontal level. Our identities across many different categories have lined up with our partisanship. And that is different from the ideological polarization of the post-civil rights era. That is a whole new level of polarization where there's no more, or there's very little cross-cutting political identification. It's not really the case anymore that a Democratic voter has some identities that might put them in alignment with a Republican voter and vice versa. Those voters do exist, but either certain attributes are so salient for them that they're just never going to they're not going to bridge the gap. So that's African American voters in particular tend to be more conservative in ways that most white Democrats aren't, but race is so salient that they're just going to stay Democrats. Or it's a very small sliver of the party coalition. So Obama to Trump voters were like 8% of the electorate in 2016, and they represent the handful of voters whose identities cross in some ways or cut in some ways that make them swingy. But generally speaking, if you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, we can guess 90% of the things about you. And it's kind of a parlor trick. It's also kind of something that's not great for the political system because it's not, again, designed for that kind of polarization, for those kinds of stark divides in the public and among the parties. So this kind of polarization, once it interacts with the House, the Senate, the presidency, or elections, by itself it's going to create gridlock. If most Republicans are in rural and exurban states, and most Democrats are in urban and suburban states, then a political system that distributes power largely not largely, but to a great degree on land, how much land your party controls, is going to result in gridlock. It's going to mean that a majority that elects a president might not be able to elect the Senate, might not be able to elect the House, and thus, in an era of partisan government, isn't really going to be able to do anything, and vice versa. And that's what we've seen. If we go back to our set of elections over the last 20 years, barring historic waves against them, Republicans have built up a pretty durable advantage in the House and the Senate. Democrats tend to win those things when all the stars align in their favor, whereas Republicans can lose the national popular vote in House, Senate, and presidential elections by a good amount, 2%, 3%, and still win a majority of seats. This is getting worse. In some conversations with students earlier today, I made the observation that with the Electoral College, for example, President Trump could probably lose up to 6 million votes and still stay president because of just where his support is, because his support is deepest in places like among white working class voters who are everywhere, but specifically are a disproportionate part of places like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Florida. And so even if he's weak among all these other groups of voters, college-educated voters, non-white voters, women, he's very weak among some of these groups. He's strong enough that he can lose millions of voters with margins everywhere and still survive. If you do the math, it's actually possible to lose something like 60% of the public, the voting public, and win the presidency if your voters are all in the right place. And if you just project forward population, where people are moving, where people are settling, in something like 50 years, most Americans are going to live in a handful of states. And so you can already see on the not too distant time horizon a world where the kind of polarization we have, where voters who live in urban areas are likely to be Democrats, voters who live in rural areas are likely to be Republicans, is producing dysfunctional political outcomes. This is especially bad in the Senate. In 1790, the largest state was Virginia. We had about 750,000 people. Most of them were not free. Smallest state was Delaware with about 60,000 people. Delaware has 12 times more power than Virginia's in the Senate. Today, obviously, it's California and Wyoming. Wyoming's have 40 times more power in the Senate. If by about 2040, 2050, most Americans will live in about 8 states, then with the next 8 states representing 20% of the population, then the remaining 34% of the states will hold about the remaining 34 states will hold about 30% of the population. In theory, you could control 68 Senate seats with voters from 34 states representing something like a quarter of the country. And again, polarization means that in that scenario, the political minority in that situation is going to be likely to be Democrats, and the political majority in that situation, or the majority of seats, is likely to be Republicans. And although that's sort of how the system's designed, it seems to me to cut against our intuitions about what a fair democratic system means. I think most people agree that there's not going to be perfect correspondence between who wins a majority and who has a majority of seats. But there's a difference between 55-45, even 60-40, and 80-20, 90-10, 75-25. And that's the kind of difference that I think that create real political instability. I will concede here that not everything is purely structural. You can imagine different political actors making different choices in different moments to create less polarization in the system. The recent example is that Mitch McConnell didn't have to be Mitch McConnell. He could have taken the opportunity of the financial crisis, of the Great Recession, to be bipartisan. There is an earlier version of Mitch McConnell as a young man, such that he's ever been a young man, who was much more bipartisan and much more willing to work together. So it's true that actions taken by individual people have affected this, but overall, what we're looking at are structural problems. We're looking at things happening on the ground in the public that aren't necessarily tied to what's happening in our politics, but have become aligned with political identities in ways that is making our system very dysfunctional. Imagine then what American politics looks like, say, 20 years from now, when these trends are even worse, right? Imagine what it looks like when one side can never accumulate enough power to implement any aspect of its agenda. Imagine how disenchanted people will be with democracy when, even if they give the majority of their votes to a presidential candidate, that person loses because of the rules, because the card says moops for Seinfeld watchers. Imagine what it means, like what it would even mean to say America has a democracy in that situation. It wouldn't really be true. I obviously think this is not great, potentially a nightmare in the making, but I think there are clear solutions to dealing with it. It's two sets of solutions, one for addressing gridlock and one for addressing polarization. The solutions to gridlock are pretty straightforward, I think. They rely on making American politics a little more majoritarian, or even much more majoritarian. The obvious one, in terms of majorities in the moment being able to do anything in the Senate, is ending the filibuster. As I've liked to point out, the filibuster is not in the Constitution. It's an extra constitutional rule. It kind of emerges by accident. Aaron Burr makes a point that if you nix one rule in the Senate book, you don't have to have a motion to call the question, and everyone's like, yeah, that makes sense, let's do it. And 30 years later, someone realizes that this change means there's unlimited debate, and the filibuster is born. And although liberals love the filibuster because it has allowed them to defeat some conservative legislation, conservative policies, generally speaking, the filibuster in American history has been used to shoot down civil rights laws, anti-lynching laws, has been a major obstacle to real progress in the country. And in the present, the kind of routine use of the filibuster, as represented by cloture votes, has essentially made lawmaking impossible in the Senate. Although it sounds nice to be able to get enough bipartisan support and get 60 votes and pass something, in practice, this polarization, this horizontal polarization across identities, this rural-urban polarization, means that there are very, very few, if any, situations where Republicans will join with Democrats or vice versa. And in turn, this means that things just don't happen. Everyone sees everything as zero sum. So let's just get rid of it. It's a simple rule change, and I think it wouldn't be transformative, but it would open up the conditions for some things to happen in the current moment before we get to the big institutional change. It would make Congress more responsive. It would do something that I think is underrated, which is if you are a voter, and let's say, as happened in 2008, you vote for a Democratic Congress, and you vote for a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president expecting them to do something, and things don't happen. For you, as a regular person with a life to live, you don't necessarily connect that to rules and the institutions, but that's what's happening. You instead blame those politicians for not doing the things they promised. But is it really their fault, or are they working with a set of rules that literally don't let them do the things they want to do? The Senate is a special problem. You can't necessarily, besides making it more majoritarian, there's not much you can do with the malapportionment that comes with geographic polarization in the country. As long as we have equal representation of states, as long as the states, as long as things are distributed by geography, the Senate's going to just be a place where there's going to be lopsided representation. There are some proposals for small things you could do. You can create more states. This is traditionally what Americans have done when there's a political problem in the Senate. They say that chunk of territory could be, 4 states, and they create them. The obvious candidates right now are Puerto Rico and D.C., should they want to become states. That would add 4 new senators. Those would likely be Democratic senators, and would begin to create a balance in the chamber. There's a crazy idea out there that is, it's crazy. it's taking California and breaking it up into something like 100 states, having all of those states elect senators and House members, those new members then voting to abolish the Senate by constitutional amendment. And then once that happens, you reconstitute California as a single state. That's insane and would never happen. But I think it does point to something that is worth thinking about, and that is, if we know the Senate's going to stay malapportioned for the duration, if we know that there's not really much we can do about that, in part because the Constitution says the Senate will always have equal representation of states unless each state agrees not to have it, then maybe the solution, above and beyond rule tweaks like the filibuster, is just to make the Senate a little less powerful. Other countries have House of Lords that have important executive functions that work with the executive branch of those countries to do oversight, to confirm ministers, but don't have much of a role in legislation. And you can imagine a Senate that operates like that, where the House does legislation and lawmaking, and the Senate does mostly executive branch partnership stuff, oversight, confirmations, investigations. Something to consider. You could do it with a simple rule change. All the Senate would have to do really is agree amongst itself to always confirm or pass whatever the House sends their way, unless some supermajority says otherwise, and you effectively have created a House of Lords. On that point, I think the weakening the Senate would, in this funny way, bring it back in line with what the framers intended for the chamber, which is to be this kind of executive committee that worked with the president. But again, that's sort of really your options for making the Senate more majoritarian, more representative, are very limited. Those are, I think, the last majoritarian gridlock problem is the one I think I've suggested earlier, which is just ending the Electoral College straight up, just no longer having it. It's not so much that the Electoral College prevents legislation happening, but that these misfires that were happening, 2000, 2016, potentially this year, if not this year, then sometime again in the near future, creates a situation where the head of government does not represent the majority of the public and makes actually pursuing their agenda much more difficult. I'm not a fan of President Trump, obviously, but I think things look very different in terms of democratic legitimacy if Trump had won a majority of votes and was now president, right? It matters. Those things really do matter. And the more our system does not produce them, the more I think it makes coalition building afterwards, lawmaking afterwards, more difficult. And so simply moving to majoritarian elections, popular vote elections for the presidency, doing what every other country does, what we do for our governor's races, makes a lot of sense in that regards. The solutions to polarization are a little less straightforward because we're talking about things that are happening on the ground in society that rely not necessarily on political and institutional tweaks, but on things happening in communities, amongst individuals. And there's an extent to which fixing that problem is going to rely on individuals exercising a little forbearance, exercising a little restraint about how they interact with each other, how they engage politically. But to the extent that there are some structural things we can do to make polarization less bad, to either accommodate horizontal polarization or work against it, I think there are a couple things. I just mentioned in the Electoral College, that would help in this regards too. The maps we see after every election are maps of winner-take-all outcomes, right? They don't actually show what the results in each state look like. So Virginia goes from being red in 2004 to blue in 2008, blue in 2010, 12, 16, likely this year. But if we actually look at like a county level map of Virginia, we know that it's not blue. If we look at a map of Virginia that shows voters by population, partisanship by population, where each person represents a little dot, what you see is just a bunch of red, blue, and purple. the state in every part is pretty politically diverse. Even the reddest parts of Virginia are still places where something like a quarter of voters back Democrats. Even the bluest parts of the state are still places where like a quarter of voters back Republicans. And that's true of the country at large. California, there are more Trump voters in California than there are in most of the South. There are more, there are something like 40% of 40% of voters in the Deep South, or 40% of voters in the Deep South are Democrats. Everywhere you look, there's political diversity. But winner-take-all systems obscure that and I think polarize along partisan lines. They create the perception that if you vote for a Democrat, or if your state votes for a Democrat 50.1%, it is a blue state and it is liberal, and there's no use if you're a Republican for ever trying to win it, and vice versa. And this encourages, I think, a kind of campaigning, a style of politicking that exacerbates polarization in the system. Doesn't create it, but makes it worse. So simply getting rid of that. Creating a situation where you have to win votes everywhere, and you would. I once sat down and tried to figure out, would it be possible to win a presidential election on the popular vote by only going to the major metropolitan areas of the country? Made it hard for myself because it's kind of plainly true that you can't do it by going to the major states. There are literally not enough people in California and New York and Illinois to do that, in Texas. But the major metropolitan areas, maybe. You can't win that way. Given the actual distribution of voters, it is impossible to win an election, national election, through the popular vote by just going to the largest cities. You would have to campaign everywhere. There might be supporters. If you're a Democrat, that would mean going to the Deep South. It would mean going to places like Oklahoma. It would mean going to the Mountain West. If you're a Republican, it would mean going to California, going to New England, going to places where normally Republicans don't really win. And I think that kind of campaigning, where both parties are now building coalitions out of diverse regions in diverse geographies, might help reduce the kind of polarization we see. It might have a knock-on effect of strengthening parties in places where they normally lose, such that maybe we never have to do the big Senate reform because all of a sudden you're seeing Republicans win in places they don't normally win and Democrats win in places they don't normally win. So there's that. Ending the Electoral College. Very passionate about this. I think the Electoral College is very bad. The fact that the House has had 435 members for about 100 years is not how it was designed. The expectation when the House was designed is that it would grow with population. And I think capping the membership of the House has a similar effect as equal representation of states does in the Senate. It sort of prevents, it creates stasis in the system. I think, given how districts are drawn, given gerrymandering, given partisan gerrymandering, it facilitates the kind of partisan polarization that contributes to the gridlock. And so one possible solution to lessening polarization in the system is just making the House bigger. Repealing the rule that caps the House size. It probably is not feasible to increase the House completely proportionately. That would get you something like 1,000 members. But 600 members, 700 members is entirely reasonable. You tear down a couple parking lots in D.C. and you put up some new buildings and you can fit 700 House members. And there's too much parking in D.C. anyway, which is also not a popular opinion. But expanding the size of the House would also feed into the next reform that I think would go a long way towards reducing polarization in the system. And that is beginning to move us towards a multi-party system. Ultimately, I think a lot of this is just a function of having two singular parties. Everything can align around two singular parties. How can you, at a certain point, you can't fully disentangle the polarization across identity, across region, because the two-party structure it all. So maybe all you do is have more than 2, 3, 4. And part of how you do that is just redo the rules of how we do elections. There's nothing that mandates what we have now, which is a winner-take-all, first-past-the-post elections in single-member districts, where each district represents one member. It's possible, just by a simple law, to create multi-member districts, where each state, say, is a single district that elects, in Virginia, 13 or 14 members, that have ranked choice proportional voting, where you can cast multiple votes for candidates, and the top vote getters across multiple rounds, say 3 rounds, end up winning the seats. And the combination of those two things would all of a sudden create a situation where if you are the Green Party, or if you're the Libertarian Party, or if you decide that, we want more liberal zoning laws in state elections, all of a sudden, it's possible to win seats. It's possible to not be a spoiler for your nearest ally in the election. And then you have the beginnings of a multi-party system. And the advantage of a multi-party system is that it creates new points for people to define themselves politically. And some of those points aren't going to be corresponding to these other identities. You might live in a city, have liberal views on X, Y, and Z, but a party forms that represents your conservative view on A, and you vote for that party instead. And that happening again and again in different circumstances doesn't just begin to move people away from the two-party binary, but in Congress, in a lawmaking body, it recreates the conditions of fluid coalition making. It kind of gets us back to what was intended, that lawmakers are making majority coalitions based off of issues, based off of things other than narrow partisan identification. This would not, what makes this difficult is the fact that we're so used to the two-party system, it's so ingrained in American politics. But I think moving in this direction is necessary if we want to sort of avoid the collision we're having with our demographics, with their polarization. It's at this point, when I kind of go on my spiel about making things more majoritarian and making things more lowercase d democratic, that I get the objection, well, aren't we a republic and not a democracy? And I think it's worth talking through this idea that the outcomes I think are perverse, that our system are producing, are the ones that it's supposed to produce. Because when people say we're a republic, not a democracy, I think what they're trying to say is that aren't we purposefully a system where majorities are stymied, where political minorities have protections, where they can bend the system in their favor? If we are heading towards a place where, say, the Senate represents a majority of the Senate represents a tiny minority of the public, or that the presidency can be won through a narrow political minority, isn't that the way things were designed? Sort of a yes or no. The yes part of it is that, yeah, the founders designed protections for political minorities into the system. Equal representation of states is one of them. The original means of Senate election by state legislature was another one of them. The idea was that the state legislature would choose a Senate, and the senators would explicitly represent the interests of the state and speak for the interests of the state in lawmaking. The Bill of Rights, obviously. The real power of individual House members to influence policy and legislating. This has sort of been lost in the modern House, but by design, House members are actually quite powerful. Compared to legislators in other countries, the individual House member has a lot of influence on the direction of policymaking, and this was, again, by design to empower these communities to stand up for themselves, and then, of course, separated and shared powers across the government. So that's kind of the point in favor. But I think the point against, the reason why it's not helpful to think of things in these terms, is first just a matter of sort of terminology. For the founders, a republic was simply a government where voters chose representatives to act on their behalf. And a democracy was sort of an Athenian-style direct democracy. New England-style town hall, right, where everyone can say their piece and have direct influence on the making of law. They weren't thinking, right, for them, a direct democracy wasn't directly electing the president or having more majoritarianism. It was a specific kind of government that they contrasted what they were making when they were arguing in favor of it. The founders also understood Republican government to include majority rule. The whole point of the Constitution was that the Articles of Confederation didn't just result in dysfunction, they resulted in a specific kind of dysfunction where small minorities of states, of voters, could essentially prevent any governance from happening. You read Alexander Hamilton complaining about this, and he's very specific about this, that the articles made strong government basically impossible. I think the framers of the Constitution wanted a kind of mediated majoritarianism, and what we are heading towards is not mediated majoritarianism, but straight up minority government, minority rule. We're heading towards the thing the Constitution was explicitly designed to head off. The other thing to consider about the democracy not Republican response is that the founders didn't anticipate political parties. They didn't anticipate the way they would organize voters into coherent majorities. They didn't anticipate the way they would structure government. I think had they anticipated it, we would have a different, our government would look very different than it does now. And then as for the Electoral College, that was initially designed to deal with what was basically a technological problem. How do you have an election for a single office in a big rural country? You don't. You have a bunch of small elections in smaller constituencies, and then those people get together and they vote. Political parties do some of that work already, and we've largely gotten past that problem. So I think that concern that these sorts of changes would result in a government that's out of keeping with the one the Constitution created is wrong. I think going in this direction, creating a more majoritarian Congress, creating a stronger House, maybe weakening the Senate, having a popularly elected president, having a multi-party democracy, I think these things get us closer to the Madisonian design we got in 1788 and can help us head off what I think is a real and serious problem. It is countries where political majorities are never able to work their will, are not stable countries. We're already beginning to see some of that here. If President Trump wins re-election this year, if he wins outright, I will be personally disappointed, but I will say that's what the voters wanted. But if he wins again, losing 5 million votes, and the rules say that he becomes president, imagine what that does to people's faith in government. And imagine how that builds in itself over time. Maybe we don't get collapse, but we do get apathy. And apathy, I think, is the fundamental threat to self-government. And I think to avoid apathy, to avoid the kind of apathy that happens when we have a system that just is no longer responsive, we just have to change it. That was the whole point. That's why we can amend the Constitution. That is what the founders intended, that when presented with these sort of fundamental political problems, we would just do something about them. All right, I'm done with my spiel. I haven't figured out an elegant way to end that, so that's hence the I'm just finished now. I think we have time for questions, so I will start with you. Yes. So the question is, what effect will the census have on sort of the election, things going forward? I mean, the census is sort of it's not low key. It is the kind of the basis of much of American society, how we apportion representatives, how funding formulas are created for localities and states. Sort of everything relies on the census. How we even figure out who voted and who didn't relies on the census. And so a accurate census is sort of extremely critical. And there is a real question as to whether we're going to have an accurate census, not just because of the administration not preparing well, not just because of its floating the citizenship question, which what critics believe it would have done, and I agree with them, is by discouraging immigrant respondents in dense areas, you would get an undercount in the densest parts of the country, meaning you would essentially redistribute power from those places to less sparsely populated places, which tend to be less diverse, more conservative, etc. And then the coronavirus might have some effect on the census as well. It is not social distancing to send people door to door to talk to them about who they are and what they're doing. Um, so I honestly have no idea. As far as this year's election, it won't have a direct effect, but redistricting is in the next year or two nationwide. Again, reapportionment across the board, and having an accurate census is critical for that. So my hope would be that the federal government's doing everything it can to make sure it gets an accurate count. But what I'm afraid is that we're not going to get that accurate count, and I'm not actually sure what happens after that. Like, if there's some way to say, well, maybe we need to do a do-over. Yes, sir.
Maybe we could take a lesson from Kansas and Nebraska prior to the Civil War, in which the slave-owning members of society encouraged their people to move into the territories and vice versa. And so perhaps with the to some extent it's happening now with a lot of progressive people going to rural areas to develop organic farms. Telecommunicating is maybe making it easier for progressives to move out to the less populated states. Maybe encouraging that might diffuse the population of progressives across the country.
If you didn't hear the question, it was perhaps encouraging people to move, progressives in particular, moving from densely populated states to less densely populated states would help. I think that's right. I'm just not sure how that would happen. I mean, there are things you could do to encourage it, right? The federal government could begin putting agencies in different parts of the country. The Trump administration kind of attempted this, but in sort of a very clearly political way, of kind of eliminating expertise, saying, well, you either have to, they were moving the agriculture department to a different part of the country and saying, well, either you move with the agriculture department or you leave. And a lot of career people were like, well, we're not gonna move out there. Our lives are here, so we'll leave. But if you can imagine doing this in a less nakedly political way, and of saying, we're going to move some agencies to other parts of the country, that's where they'll be based, and that might move people from one place to another. One way this is happening kind of naturally, and I think the dynamic is bad, but this is one consequence of it, is the fact that in California, for example, it's almost illegal to build housing in large parts of the state, and prices are skyrocketing as a result, means that people are just leaving California by the tens of thousands. There's the projection is that California is on track to start losing population on net, and they're moving to Oregon, they're moving to Idaho, they're moving to Nevada, they're moving to Arizona, they're moving to Texas. And that by itself, in the same way that Northeasterners moving down to Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia has really changed the shape of the politics in those states, or it's changing the shape of the politics in those states, a similar migration might do the same. And that might solve your problem right there. But I still think, just given how fast the United States is growing overall, given where those people are headed, we still run into the same problem. Because even if you have millions of people showing up in Nevada, Arizona, Texas, Georgia, the southern parts of the state, that still leaves a large, emptier part of the country that retains its political representation in the same way. And you still, I think, run into the same dynamic, even if you can delay it a little bit. But you're right to suggest that simply getting people to move might do it, whether they would want to.
Might be just as easy as all the other solutions. Like
I'm kind of an idea guy. Questions on this side? Yes, sir. I think the best model, I mean, the model for what I would envision is simply just a state with healthy political competition, where institutions that make democracy happen aren't completely misaligning what people say they want with what is actually happening. And that's the case in some places. I think that's kind of the case in Virginia for the most part. Things are not perfect here, but we have, our malapportionment isn't too bad. With the recent with the courts recently kind of redrawing our districts, there's a better connection between who people are voting for, who is actually elected, and who actually holds power. I think, so having said that, it's also true that I think much more than examples of healthy political competition, we do have a lot of examples of kind of these one-party states where there isn't much political competition. And I think when you look at those states, you see, whether they're blue or red, a lot of dysfunction. In Illinois, you have a lot of corruption, right? And if Illinois were more competitive, had more partisan competition, Republicans might be able to utilize that to win majorities and like push back against it. But as it stands, it's so heavily Democratic, that's not going to happen. Texas, red state. Even as the population is diversifying, statewide and local offices are largely held by Republicans. And one outcome of that, given the awareness that the state is changing, is a push to make it more difficult to participate in the political system at all. Difficult to register to vote, difficult to actually vote if you want to vote. On Super Tuesday, the long 7-hour lines to vote are by design, right? That is a policy outcome that someone wanted to happen. That is success for whoever wanted that to happen. And my kind of general fear about American democracy going forward is that we're either moving towards complete apathy when people begin to see that their political actions do not produce the kind of choices they want, no matter how much support they win for them, or I think one of the live options right now is the party that understands that its grip on power depends on institutions that don't work, instead of deciding let's fix them and then win people over, they'll decide let's not fix them and then keep people from even coming out to begin with, right? Let's rig the census to distribute power away from the places that don't vote for us. Let's encourage more and greater obstacles to voting. Let's publicize voter fraud and say that this is a thing that's happening and encourage our supporters in the states to take steps against it, right? So that is also a potential outcome here, and either of them is not one for, bad hyperbole, so I'll just say they're bad. It's not optimal.
What are your thoughts about a solution of something similar to Australia, where there's a law you have to keep?
Right.
So every politician would have to keep every single vote and not tell people to disturb people from voting unless sometimes.
Question is, what about mandatory voting? So my immediate reaction, the first time I heard someone talk about mandatory voting, my first reaction was, no one can tell me what to vote. I'll vote if I want to vote. I'm probably going to vote. But I don't like the idea of the state saying you have to vote. Now, I know in Australia, I think the way it works is that if you do not vote, you can go cast a ballot, but you don't have to actually vote for anyone. I'm not sure if there are any penalties for voting. There might be like a small fine or something. I think I would much rather see what happens if we have more accessible voting first, right? Like, as it stands, the voting system we have is basically geared towards people who live relatively stable lives, right? So if you have a regular address, own a home, have an apartment that you've been in for some time, if you have access to the financial system, you have a bank account, or if you have a steady job, whether a wage-paying job or a salaried job, it's generally easy to vote. It's easy to get the documents to vote. It's easy to make the time to go vote. As you begin to take away things, let's say you move from place to place very often. Let's say you have a job, but your hours are not regular. Let's say you are homeless. As you begin to add things in, at points of instability in someone's life, it becomes much harder to vote under the system we have. And so if we sort of opened up voting to make it the kind of thing that no matter how unstable your life is, So that would mean automatic voter registration. That would mean mail-in balloting. That would mean election day holidays. That would mean long period of early voting. That kind of thing. If we do that and you see turnout go up considerably, then I would be like, you don't got to make people vote. People vote if they want to vote. If we are running into a situation where where turnout is still very low, and that's having kind of like adverse effects on the system, I think you probably have other problems you have to deal with, but mandatory voting might be something to kind of make everyone take it seriously. But I think the primary problem in the United States right now is just that voting is kind of hard if you are not, a stable middle class person.
So do you think that a force the government to make it easier for citizens to have more access to mail-in voting, provide online way?
It's kind of like a chicken and egg, like the world in which the government mandates voting is probably the world in which you have people who want people to vote in power, and in that world they probably would have already done the things to make voting easier to do. I feel like you have to start from the beginning, right? You have to say at the beginning everyone has to vote, and then if there are other problems afterwards, but we're at a place where the norm is that you vote if you want to vote, and the problem appears to be that people who want to vote have obstacles they have to get over to make that happen. I keep thinking back to the guy who stood in line for 7 hours to cast a ballot in a primary, right? That to me is like grotesque. Not that primaries are important, but he's not even voting for the person who's going to represent him in the end. He's voting to choose the person who might represent him, and he had to stand in line for 7 hours. And to me, those were the immediate problems to tackle. Sir.
Spent a lot of time on geography. That's a compelling part of the whole big picture. You just kind of glazed over generations.
Yeah.
Did a survey of Gen Z folks, and a lot of the social issues that drive the Republican Party, same-sex marriage, things like that. The survey data shows that they're not even talking about it. It's a foregone conclusion. It's done. It's not an issue. It's over. And so if you are a Republican and you see that, yes, right now they're not voting when their 22nd vote. Eventually, that's got to scare the heck out of you if you're a Republican. That there's a holy shit. They're more likely to have friends of different races, of different religions, deeper friendships, all these kind of things that are what the Republicans count on right now to get votes. And, don't you think that eventually that's also going to weigh in on this, even with structural impediments?
I think it's certainly possible. I mean, some of this depends on sort of like the geographic distribution of where these people are, right? Like, to say it's Gen Z does not necessarily mean that Gen Z everywhere is similarly sort of like composed demographically. It's possible that the split, because there's still, right, like 30, 40%, 30, 35% of people who have the traditional conservative views in that generation. It's entirely possible that they too are favorably distributed geographically in a way that kind of doesn't necessarily get to the problem. But let's say that's not the case. It's a bit of a unicorn. That is certainly true, but that's a long time it's a long time horizon. That's 30 to 40 years of waiting for things to break. And I'm not entirely sure that we have 30 to 40 years, given the speed at which a lot of the changes are happening demographically. And given the speed at which at least one political faction has decided that it cannot no longer win on a normal term.
Right.
That's a part of the argument that I didn't really get into, because I think this part of the pressure to change comes from the fact that there are political actors who've decided the only way they can win is by keeping other people from voting. That will eventually just lead to dangerous things. We've already seen what that